This is Facepalm America. I'm Beowulf Rockland. In 1972, so 50 plus years ago, a group of students dared to take on one of the most powerful industries in America, as well as the federal government, and won one of the most expansive decisions on standing in Supreme Court history. Neil Thomas Proto is one of 5 law students from the George Washington University of Law School who sued to challenge a nationwide railroad freight increase approved by the Interstate Commerce Commission. He's also the author of To a High Court: 5 Bold Law Students Challenge Corporate Greed and Change the Law. Neil Thomas Proto, welcome to Facepalm America. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
So give us a little bit of background here personally. What was your life like in 1972, and what made you decide to make it so much busier by becoming involved in this?
Well, I think like many law students at the time, there was a compelling need or desire to want to do practical, real-life legal experiences, to get those kind of experiences and not be just confined to what might occur within a classroom. And so the course that we started with, although the course turned out to be of marginal consequence, the course that we started with was called Unfair Trade Practices. And we had a choice. We could do the textbook and participate in class and take the exam, or do the textbook, participate in class, and do a practical group project that we would choose on our own. And so I formed this group. There were 5 of us. Some of them I knew, a few I didn't. And we came up with an idea after about a week worth of research that showed us that the nation's railroads, their entire freight rate structure throughout the nation, discriminated against the movement of recyclable materials. Now, this is a time when this is a very cutting-edge issue, but more importantly, it also meant that they encouraged the extraction unnecessarily of natural resources.
Right.
And so you looked at the harm that was going on, and some of those resources belong to the nation's railroads. If one goes back a century or so, you'll see that when the United States encouraged railroads construction across the nation, they gave them 150 million acres of natural resources.
Wow.
And so when it came to things like timber, coal, iron ore, all of those got favorable freight rate increases. And what we now think of as recyclable materials were completely discriminated against.
Right.
And just
for context, this was in the wake of the passage of the act which established the Environmental Protection Agency.
That's correct. And so what we were looking for it was also cutting edge in the sense that it was a brand new law.
Right.
The National Environmental Policy Act required environmental impact statements. And that's what we wanted.
Okay.
And we did battle for that. We began not with the lawsuit, which didn't come for 8 months, but rather in our battle was really in front of the Interstate Commerce Commission, where we petitioned the commission not only to require an environmental impact statement, which they had not done, in approving a 21% freight rate increase throughout the whole country. But we not only requested that, we wanted all the money refunded.
Right.
We said everything that had been collected in violation of the law, that is, there was no impact statement, should be refunded to all the shippers. Now, of course, we were not shippers. And if there was a group the Interstate Commerce Commission never heard of, it was us. It was a group of law students. And as you alluded to, the name of the group was Students Challenging Regulatory Agency Procedures. SCRAP was the acronym. And 8 months later, after battle, we sued the United States of America.
Let me ask you something quickly, because given that this started as a class project, how was it that you determined to focus on this particular area of regulatory policy?
Well, we examined 4 or 5 possibilities. Now, mind you, this occurs in a very short period of time. The in the course context, which only lasted that one semester,
Right.
in the course context, the professor said, you have a week. You have a week to come up with an idea,
Right.
because this is very time consuming. He wanted to be certain we were acted responsibly, that we knew what we were doing, that there was a lot at stake. And so we looked at 4 or 5 possibilities. And then there was a student who mentioned this idea to me. He said, I don't understand this, Neil, but this is what I understood to be, that these railroad freight rates harm the environment. I'm not quite sure how. So when I raised that possibility with the students that I was working with, we liked it. It involved a major and the oldest regulatory agency then. It involved a huge corporate interests. All these major law firms in the nation represented them. And it involved the environment. And so we examined those. We went to the commission. We looked at all these proceedings. We examined the law. None of us had ever taken environmental law, so we had to learn that, or at least learn what was necessary. And in a very intense way, we came up with our proposal, which is to do what we finally did. Now, filing the lawsuit was not among that, but that's what came.
So,
I mean, our goal was to petition the commission and stop the railroads from doing this.
Gotcha. Okay, and then it evolved from that point. And just to reiterate, as I understand it, at the core of all of this was a regulation, an increase in cost that ultimately made recycling more expensive, so that it stood in contradiction to the recently passed environmental law.
Yes, I think that is absolutely correct. That is correct. And let me just add one other thing, that when we went over to the commission the very first time, in that first week, and we looked at all these proceedings, the only group that opposed the railroad rate increases in a conscientious, thoughtful, deliberate way were the nation's cities. And what they were focused on is, what are we going to do with all this refuse, all this scrap material, all this garbage, all these papers? And many cities were burning them.
Yeah.
They were dumping them in water and elsewhere. I mean, they were enormously harmful. And so you had this real deep concern that had a very practical effect.
Okay, so that was part of the basis, ultimately, of your suit as well. What were the other key aspects involved? Because it seems like the main response of the firms that represented these companies was, or rather the regulators, was not so much to say no, you're wrong about this, but to say you don't have the right to sue us because of who you are.
Yes, and if that's exactly the issue that caused the most consternation for the railroads, for the United States of America, and for their law firms. And that's exactly what they went after. Without getting deep into the law, and I think I can make this very simple. The Constitution has one provision that deals with what the court can or cannot, what kind of cases it can take. It says there must be a, quote, case or controversy. It's in Article 3 of the Constitution.
Right.
And so the court concluded 5-3 that we had standing to sue, as is the term used. That's what they objected to. That's what the railroads didn't want, their law firms didn't want, and the United States didn't want. We won. And I want to add that we won in an opinion written by one of the most conservative members of the court at the time, Potter Stewart.
Okay. So I'm interested because I understand that the issue of standing really is kind of the critical thing that comes out of this. To begin with, how was it determined that you had standing? It seems to me, just from my non-legal perspective, that someone who is impacted by something deleterious to the environment would have standing to sue. But what was the specific basis on which it was determined that you legally were allowed to present this case?
There were actually three or four.
Okay.
What they mostly focused on was that we claimed that there was harm to our recreational and aesthetic and health interests
Right.
by the failure to recycle, and we identified all the ways that could be. And we also needed to do that not as a group alone, but also by individuals. And so you'll find in the lawsuit that we filed, where you have to identify your harm, we do it by name, Neil Proto, et cetera, et cetera. And so it was, you had to demonstrate individual harm, not just group harm. And that's what we did. And the court found that meant the law at the time.
Okay. How did this open up the door for individuals to challenge these huge changes and impositions upon them in a way that it seems like they wouldn't have even conceptualized prior to that point?
Well, that question is fraught with challenge. Is the only word I can think of, and I mean that in a very practical legal way, a very practical, not just legal way, but and let me see if I can describe this to you. Two things came out of this case. One was the precedent,
right? The
lawyer term for, okay, now you have a court decision. Right. What does it mean? And how does it affect the rights of others? Exactly the question you posed. But the second thing that came out of it that was equally frightening to corporations was scrap as the model for other law students.
Right.
And so that battle, the battle that ensues afterwards, and it's still going on, is twofold. One, scrap as precedent, and two, scrap as a model.
Okay. So how has that evolved over the course of the succeeding decades? Has it kind of fallen from that point? Have corporations been able to erode that precedent through successive cases? Where do we stand in 2023?
Well, great question, and I'm glad you asked, because there's two things going on. The first is, with respect to the precedent, there was a very deliberate effort. It began with Justice Powell, who was appointed to the Supreme Court, but did not sit on the scrap case because he had conflicts. He represented the railroad industry.
Okay.
So he chose not to do it, but he led the effort to undo the value of the precedent. At the same, and so he, Justice Scalia, Justice Roberts, they go after scrap as if it was
as if it was scrap.
Yeah, as if it was really, there was this compelling need on their part to undo the meaning of it.
Right.
And they're still frustrated by it. I could go through a bunch of cases where scrap emerges. Robert calls some cases scrap for a new generation. Scalia refers to the scrap era.
Right.
And even recently, in the case involving, this is a lawyer's thing. Yeah. You'd have to look closely. But in Biden versus Nevada, it's the case about student loans,
right? Where
the Supreme Court says, "Okay, you, President Biden, don't have the authority to do this anymore."
Right.
There was a desperate need by Roberts and others to find someone with the standing to sue,
right?
So they could challenge that.
Right.
And it is a oblique journey that Roberts engages in to find an agency that has a very attenuated relationship to the state of Missouri.
Right.
And it's really quite remarkable. But in the process of doing that, Justice Kagan reminds him that the analysis he uses is exactly the one he didn't want to use before, because he was using it to undo scrap.
Right.
Now he uses it.
And